Hello everyone. With this instructional teach, I will explain the theory behind the contiguity principle using examples of how and how not to use text with graphics. When descriptions of images are not placed very close to the images, in close proximity in other words, then students must use their precious cognitive resources searching for words which connect to which part of the image. According to Mayer, this closeness principle lets students devote their cognitive resources to the processes of active learning, including building connections between words and pictures. In other words, if you are using on-screen text to explain a graphic, the closer in proximity the words are to the part of the graphic that it refers to, the less likely it will cause cognitive overload. Let's look at a few examples. This example shows two different ways of presenting the same information about the water cycle. The top example separates the important definitions from the image of how the water cycle works. So in this case, the explanations are separated from the explanation or from the graphic itself. The bottom example incorporates the spatial contiguity principle and includes the important definitions in the illustration itself. The result is a more effective display of visual information, resulting in less strain in the visual channel. In the top example, the contiguity principle is violated because the labels indicating the parts of the brain are physically separated from the image of the brain. Your eyes have to constantly move from the captions at the bottom of the graphic to find the corresponding letter on the graphic itself. This causes an increased cognitive load in the visual channel. In the bottom example, the contiguity principle is followed because the labels of the parts of the brain are placed physically near the parts of the brain to which they correspond. This reduces the distance the eye has to follow, reducing the cognitive load on the visual channel. In this example, the top graphic shows text that is separated from the graphic. This causes stress in the visual channel. The bottom example shows that the text is integrated with the graphic. This reduces cognitive load in that visual channel. So as you can see, the on-screen text that explains, in this case, water vapor, is easier on the cognitive load when it's integrated with the graphic itself instead of a label or a caption at the bottom of the display of the graphic. Here's another example of the contiguity principle. In the top picture, the explanations are in a list separated from the graphic. In the bottom picture, these explanations are integrated to the graphic itself, moving the text closer to the area represented and then using arrows to point to the items themselves. So there again, you put the explanation of the components of the graphic on the screen as near to the graphic as possible that's being explained. Good e-learning should follow the following rules as they relate to the contiguity principle. Screens that place printed text next to the portion of the graphic it describes. This is using the contiguity principle properly, placing printed text next to the portion of the graphic it describes. We've just seen a lot of examples of that. If you have feedback, it should appear on the same screen as the question and responses, so the feedback should be in close proximity to these. The same thing with the directions. They should appear on the same screen in which the steps are to be applied. Linked information does not appear in the windows that obscure related information on the primary screen. Animations that can be played independently of text that describes the animation. Text should be placed next to or within the graphics rather than below them. Legend callouts that are embedded within the graphic rather than separated from it. And finally, narrated graphics in which the corresponding words and graphics are presented at the same time. And this is one of the rules that I follow in most of my trainings that I have already produced for you. Narrated graphics in which corresponding words and graphics are presented at the same time. One thing you should also do is list any of the graphics or any of the resources that you've used as you produce your training. It's called fair use policy. For educational purposes, you can use graphics and text that are from the internet as long as you cite them. So as long as it's used for educational purposes, most of the time you're going to stay out of trouble. So what I always say in my classes, if you didn't write it, you should cite it. Or in this case, if you didn't create the image, you should cite it. So with this teach, I've tried to explain the theory behind the contiguity principle using examples of how and how not to use text with graphics. You will use these concepts as you develop your training.